Hello, and welcome to the Poison Paint Factory. My factory designated name is Poison226. Nice to meet you. Who's to say who is right and who is wrong? Isn't good and bad just a human construct, a concept that changes based on our outlook? Interestingly, could something spawned in hell, a killing machine for the devil, ever be a good guy? What if he had a human heart, a reason to do good? Today I want to talk about my favourite anti-hero, Spawn. So what specifically about Spawn shall we discuss? The comic? The character? The creator? What about the 97 live action movie? The 3-season animated series or their PG movie counterparts? How about the video games? What about the toys? Well, the first time I became aware of Spawn was seeing his face on the packaging for figures from the live action movie. I didn't see the film at the time, and in fact I didn't see Spawn again in any form until a trip to France when I bought one of the comics. I couldn't read French, but it looked so badass I couldn't take my eyes off it. I still have that comic, and yes, I still don't know what any of it means. Since Spawn has a rich and interesting history and is my favourite anti-hero, you know I have a lot to say about it. So let's get some guidelines set and let's keep this on track. In this video we'll start with Spawn the character, covering his appearance and powers. Next we'll discuss Spawn the creation, looking at who was involved in the making of Spawn from the initial concept through to full colour comic books. In part 2 we'll discuss the story of the first 32 issues of the mainline comic. This will cover the classic Spawn era. Finally, we'll take a look at this awesome mini and chat with the seller. Disclaimer: a lot of the information presented in this video is public information that I researched alongside my interpretation and opinions. Sources will be linked in the description, and yes, there will be spoilers. So, with all that said, let's get on with Spawn the character. So just who the hell is Spawn? What is Spawn? Well, in the creator's own words, I first conceived the idea for the character of Spawn when I was in high school. The original costume I drew is essentially the same other than the colour, which was originally blue. As I gained experience, my drawings became more fluid. Do I have a master plan? Yes. Do I know the end of the story? Yes. Do I hope I will never have to tell it? Yes. I have conceived the ending of Spawn, but the only way I would tell it is if nobody cared about the character anymore. Hopefully, done right, I won't have to tell that story. I'm hoping that Spawn, sort of like Superman or Batman, will outlive the creator. I've always said Mickey Mouse is still alive, but Disney isn't. His creative children have surpassed his longevity. So Spawn's a man who's no longer a man. He's a good guy who does bad things. He has a living, breathing costume. He has a heart of gold but a bad temper and prone to mood swings. He can brood with the best of them. He is an ex-marine, a former assassin. Did I mention he went to hell and was so badass he became leader of Hell's army? He has super strength, speed and endurance, magic and guns. Yes, I did say magic. Think of it like all the offensive and defensive magic you can have. He has all of that. But it's cool because it's called necroplasm. So less Gandalf the Grey and more the Horned King from Black Cauldron. You think this means he's a little OP, and normally you'd be right, but then again, it takes a very special type of hero to fight both heaven and hell, and if he's going to be the ultimate badass, he needs to look like the ultimate badass. Spawn looks like this, or this, or this. Or maybe like this. Spawn's costume is a symbiote. It needs a host to live. Al Simmons is that host. The symbiote shows conscious thought at times, and it has the ability to change shape, hence Spawn having the ability to change his appearance without having to nip down to the super tailor for some new threads. He's obviously never had a run-in with Edna, as he has got quite possibly the longest cape of any superhero I've ever seen. With being part of the symbiote, it can change shape, size and density, so maybe she'd give him a pass, I don't know. Quick shout out to the live action movie in '97. Dan Lester nailed the look of Spawn, but then again he did the costume work on Predator 2, so it was bound to look good. As well as having a symbiotic costume, Spawn is dead. Oh, sorry, spoilers. He has necroplasm instead of blood, which is green glowing substance that is magical. And this substance can basically allow Spawn to do anything. It can get a bit plot armory at times, but he only has a finite amount, which is displayed regularly in the early issues as a series of numbers, but it's never explained how it's read. All we know is that when the counter gets down to 0, Spawn is in for a bad time. I actually really like this. Spawn can do just about anything, get out of almost any situation, but he has to manage his power, which takes time. Like a child learning his own strength, at first everything he does just bleeds power, taking way more energy than necessary and making the power count plummet. But as he learns and gets better at controlling his powers, doing the same actions take less energy. Spawn needs to do something crazy like patch up a gaping hole in his chest, happens more than I'd like to say. He has to exert a large amount of power, so it's in his best interest to not let himself get blown to bits in the first place, even if it wouldn't necessarily kill him. Interestingly, this can be used quite effectively in the story, as there's an instance where instead of healing himself fully and wasting his energy, Spawn just covers the hole in his chest with his costume, leaving the wound alone and allowing himself to be blasted in the stomach as a great combat tactic. As you can imagine, it doesn't work, but points for originality, I guess. Spawn also has big, heavy-looking chains that protect him or grab his victims, allowing him to hold them with no effort. Did I mention he has spikes? Spikes just everywhere, which to be honest look great but are very rarely used in any meaningful way. With great power comes great, power. Spawn, because of necroplasm, has an almost unfair amount of powers, on top of the usual superpowers of super strength, speed, agility, and durability. Spawn can also regenerate, heal himself and others, shoot necroplasm from his hands, breathe fire, create illusions to confuse his enemies, teleport, become invisible, pause time, read minds, sense emotions and intentions from others, shapeshift, control animals, see the future, telekinesis, manipulate the environment around him, control nature, and he can borrow life energy from others. Now, as someone who's read a great deal of these comics, watched the animated show and the movie, I've consumed a lot of Spawn media over the years, and even I'm surprised by some of these powers. And look, I know it's a huge list and it really sounds like Todd went to town with his creation, giving him all the powers please, but I'd argue that it doesn't really feel like that. Yes, Spawn is pretty OP as a hero, but not all of these powers were given to him all at once. It's a slow process that took a lot of time. Spawn is still figuring out what he's capable of to this day, so I wouldn't be surprised if his list grows longer still. On the other side of the coin, like all great heroes, his powers can be a curse to him, and neither living nor truly dead anymore seems to be something that he finds hard to deal with, as well as the fact that everything he does with his powers takes him one step closer to the fire and brimstone of hell. In order to save himself from such a fate, Spawn tries to limit his power use. He's an expert marksman from his time working as an assassin, so guns and big freaking guns are a staple of the early issues. It creates a really interesting dynamic and shows that everything he has to do has consequences and has to be thought about. I really like this in heroes. I like when they have to decide if they're going to use their powers or not. I like how painful it looks when Wolverine tears his claws through his fists, or when Bruce Banner turns into the Hulk. Speaking of consequences to actions, you might think as someone who is already technically dead, but can regenerate and heal themselves against further lethal wounds, Spawn can't truly die. Well, turns out the dead can die again. If Spawn is decapitated or depletes all his necroplasm, that counter hits 0, well, He will die, double die, end back up in hell. He's also weak to dead zones. Think of them as no man's land on Earth between the powers of heaven and hell, where Spawn's powers are greatly weakened. This leaves him vulnerable and at risk of a double death. Spawn is a pretty neat character with some incredible powers, but who created him, and who helped him become this record-breaking comic? Todd McFarlane created the anti-hero Spawn, with him hitting comic book shelves, that's Spawn, not literally McFarlane, in May of 1992, and he had the honour of being one of the first wave of Image comics. You may recognise the name Todd McFarlane, and so you should. If you like your comic books campy and bright, if you think of Batman and you think Adam West or George Bat Nichols, Never Leave the Cave Without It, Clooney, you're right out of luck. Todd brought darkness, horror, realism and hyper-detailed art to whichever publisher he worked at. Think what Christopher Nolan did to Batman. No, wait, think what Tim Burton did to Batman, but to comic books. Born on 16th March 1961 in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, Todd quickly fell in love with comic books. He became a massive nerd. I mean fan. I always get them mixed up. As a massive fan when he was a teenager, he was already designing his own characters and daydreaming of Frank Miller's or Art Adams' work. In 1984, he broke into comics and was quickly working for Marvel and DC. He was initially famous for his works as an artist for Marvel while working on the Spider-Man comics of the late 80s and early 90s. While on art duties for the webhead himself, he would co-create a little character you might know. Oh, yeah, you wanted me to tell you. Nah, come on. Why don't you guess? You know this one, I promise, don't worry. No? Really? You give up? It's Venom. Yes, that Venom. Todd drew 29 issues of Amazing Spider-Man before he spoke with the then current editor Jim Salicrup, explaining that he wanted to cut his teeth on writing and drawing his own stuff. Jim offered him a new start, just what Todd wanted. He could draw and write whatever he wanted for this new book, simply called Spider-Man. Well, at least he got to do something new with something familiar, right? He wrote 15 issues before leaving the book due to creative differences with the new editor, Dan Fingeroth. So on top of working for Marvel and DC, getting to draw some of the biggest characters those publications had to offer, creating amazing new characters like Venom, and writing his own Spider-Man book, McFarlane took these skills and became one of the founding members of Image Comics, the publishing house that brought you Walking Dead, I Kill Giants, Youngblood, The Wicked and Divine, Witchblade, Kick-Ass, Saga, Rat Queens, Invincible, Savage Dragon, just to name a few. There's actually quite an interesting story about the founding of Image Comics, starting this moment, from now. From this moment on, this will be the moment, starting now, of the genesis of Image Comics. I'd love to cover this in more depth sometime, so watch this space. No, this space. How about... I've been told I keep getting distracted and should stick to the script. Sorry. So Image Comics publishing house was founded in 1992, with the first Spawn comics being published in May of that same year, which sold over 1.7 million copies. It's an amazing feat really, because at the time Image was a wildcard publisher with no proven heritage, kinda. The artists were known, but their brand new, creator-owned characters were not, which was kind of the point the artists were trying to make to the upper management teams of Marvel DC Studios at the time. And was their point valid? Well, a quick search of pre-order sales for May 1992 shows that, yep, Spawn outsold everyone, including ongoing X-Men titles, Batman, and the Avengers blockbuster comic The Infinity War, with the mainline Spider-Man title dropping to 7th place. This made Todd's brand new comic book the new record holder for the most pre-order sales of a creator-owned comic book. Nice. So how does an unknown character in a new comic book break world records so quickly? Well, visually, Spawn has it all. The long crimson cape, the spikes, the whipping chains, the glowing green eye. Part Dracula, part Batman, with a sprinkling of Spider-Man, Venom, Ghost Rider and the Punisher, probably. No one could touch Spawn when it came to appearance. He just oozes cool, and that brought in many new fans before they'd even opened the comic book. Visually, it has gone through a few changes over the years, as most comic book characters do. This can be due to new artists being at the helm, or some world-changing story arc. Spawn is not immune to this. Spawn and his costume mean something different to different fans. In early issues, he is slimmed down but muscular, with red details on his ribs and white crosses down his arms. He looks more Doctor Strange meets Spider-Man, wizardy and grounded in a more fantasy setting. How about Shoelace Face, Spawn? He took a batarang to the face when teaming up with Gotham's finest, and instead of using his powers to heal the cruel wound, he just gets one of his mates to stitch him back up with a shoelace. He keeps the shoelace as part of his look from issues 21 up to issue 50, even when other aspects of his costume change. My personal favourite costume starts as the beaten and battered Spawn from the Angela miniseries, or mainline issue 29 if you don't read spin-offs, where his once majestic cape is tattered and torn beyond recognition after an encounter with the new Redeemer. After getting absolutely squashed like a jobber, his costume is almost completely destroyed and has to rebuild itself, which it does with a new cape, big spiky boot and gauntlet, and the red on his ribs has become a more subdued black. Issue 32 is like a real homecoming for the character. He's reborn and the costume lives again. Okay, we know the Spawn book had some serious artistic style. Having Todd McFarlane as the sole artist working on it from issues 1 to 15, you know it looked good, but he couldn't keep drawing the Crimson Cape, Dark Avenger Spawn forever. He needed new blood, which you would find in artist Greg Capullo. Greg Capullo is a favourite of mine. I first saw his work in the Spawn series and then doubly fell in love with his style when he worked on Batman with Scott Snyder for the New 52s era. Greg started his upward sweep at Marvel when he was told to fill Rob Liefeld's shoes as artist on X-Force when Rob left for Image Comics. Capullo was uninterested in working for Todd and Image, let alone drawing Spawn when they came knocking for him in 1993 with an offer. He'd been drawing X-Force for less than a year at this point. Why would he want to mess up a sure thing? Well, the opportunities Capullo thought would come to pass didn't, so he decided working for Image might not be the worst idea after all. After penciling duties on the third issue of the Violator spin-off, he's a villain, get your dirty mind out the gutter. He took over the Spawn mainline adventure from issues 16 to 20 before a game of art tag started up for the next few arcs between Todd and Greg, with Greg taking over drawing the art almost exclusively from issues 49 to 100. According to my reliable source Wikipedia, don't laugh, I'm trying my best here. In comic books, the inker, sometimes credited as the finisher or embellisher, is one of two line artists in traditional comic book production. The penciler creates a drawing, the inker outlines, interprets, finalizes, retraces this drawing by using a pencil, pen or brush. Inking was necessary in the traditional printing process as pressers could not reproduce pencil drawings. Inking of text is usually handled by another specialist, the letterer, the application of colours by the colourist. As the last hand in the production chain before the colourist, the inker has the final word on the look of the page and can help control the story's mood, pace and reliability. Also of note, my sources say, while inking can involve tracing penciled lines in a literal sense, it also requires interpreting the pencils, giving proper weight to the lines, correcting mistakes, and making other creative choices. The look of a penciler's final art can vary enormously depending on the inker. A pencil drawing can have an infinite number of shades of grey, depending on the hardness of the graphite and the pressure applied by the artist. By contrast, an ink line generally can only be solid black. Accordingly, the inker has to translate pencil shadings into patterns of ink, for example by using closely spaced parallel lines, feathering or cross-hatching. So in summary, pencil art is not consistently dark enough for comic book reproduction. Therefore, the pencil work needs to be deepened or traced with pure black ink. Inking. They fix mistakes, and they add shading and colour in the shadows, with inking being the last of the drawing processes. They are somewhat an art editor. I guess this is why McFarlane and Capullo choose to ink their own works. It's their interpretation of their art, their story. They know what it's meant to mean, so they are most qualified for this job. So let's talk Spawn specifics. Who inked what and when? There have been lots of people jumping on and off inking duty, so let's try and keep this brief.
Todd inked between issues 1 and 15. Dan Panosian, Max Vibert, and Mark Pennington inked between 16 and 20. Todd jumps back on from 21 to 24 with issue 25 being inked by Bat Billy Tan. Still with me? Good. 26 to 37 was Greg Capullo. Here comes a mess of it, might not be 100% accurate. Kevin Conran, Danny Mickey seems to take it in turns between 38 and 50. Todd comes back out of nowhere and inks between 51 and 75. I guess Kevin and Danny couldn't play nice, with Danny Mickey finishing off inking issues between 76 and 100. Got it? Good.
This one should be nice and simple. Textbook definition of a letterer is someone who draws or writes anything text-based in a comic book. That's speech bubbles, the text in the speech bubbles, and the sound effects. If it's text, it's the letterer's job. For Spawn, Tom Orzechowski has done all the lettering except issue 44, which was done by Lois Bahalis. If you've read any Spawn, you'll have noticed what a monumental task this actually is. There's so much speech or text that it sometimes might even be a bit too much. The adage, show don't tell, can be applied to comic books as well as novels and movies. It's probably the thing Spawn gets criticised most for, but I really don't mind it. There's a lot to take in with loads of characters, and one long narrative that, yes, may get retconned from time to time. I'm looking at you, Chapel. But I think it makes Spawn feel like an epic graphic novel, the same way that in poetry, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, not that Homer. Dante's Divine Comedy, not that Dante. Or Milton's Paradise Lost were actually epic poems in comparison to standard poetry. If you're going to try and tackle heaven and hell, you've got to go big or go home, right? Let's talk about Orzechowski, aka Oz. Tom started at Marvel in 1972, fixing lettering on pretty much all the mainline titles at one time or another, until in 1979 he started working on X-Men with Chris Claremont. If you know your comics, straight away that name will mean something to you. Dark Phoenix, anyone? Yep, Tom worked as letter on that one. You know that Wolverine story Claremont wrote and Frank Miller penciled? Tom lettered on that. How about the Days of Future Past storyline? Yep, he lettered on that one too. He was synonymous with Claremont and X-Men for 25 years, so when Claremont, his partner in crime, decided to diversify in the 90s, what do you think Tom did? Well actually, instead of following Claremont, Tom stuck it out and tried to find the same chemistry of the new writers. Unfortunately, after a while he didn't feel like he was working with the same characters he'd been lettering as before, and called it a day. He went on to letter for a manga company called Studio Proteus from 1989 to 2004 on titles such as Appleseed, Domination, and Ghost in the Shell. It was during this time that Image started up, and Todd asked Tom if he would letter for his new book. Tom agreed and went to Image and settled down for the next. He's still there? Fun note, but Lois Bahalis, who lettered issue 44 of Spawn, is known for their work on various X-Men titles and the Spider-Man 2099 series. If anyone knows the reason why Tom didn't letter on issue 44, please let me know in the comments, I'd love to know. We've discussed many aspects on who helped with Spawn the creation, but there's one more key player we're missing. Consider this. If you think of comic book creators like a band, you have the writer, who's the singer. They're cool, they shape the sound with their melodies people relate to, they make the sound have meaning. You have the artist, who's the lead guitarist. They're also cool, might even be cooler than the singer in some cases. They build on what the singer started by making them sound great with solos and intricate sounds that you can feel emotionally. Then you have the inker, who's the rhythm guitarist. They're not as cool as the lead guitarist, but they bulk up what the lead guitarist laid down, or keep the song from sounding empty while the lead starts shredding out a sick solo. You have the letterer, who's like a drummer. They take what everyone else is laying down and make it make sense. Something to dance to, something that sounds like music, a way to understand what everyone else is doing. And finally, you have the colorist, who's like the bassist of the band, often forgotten about, usually ridiculed, and maybe lost in the wall of noise, but they lock into what the drummer is doing and translate the sound of the drums into the language of guitar, creating an important link and harmony between all. Collectively, each member of the band brings something unique to the full sound experience, and each one relies on their fellow musician to do what they do best. So too are comic books a creation of a group effort, all equal and important but colourists. Now they are one of the last lines of defence to tidy up or harmonise any previous errors, sometimes finding themselves with only a weekend to turn around a whole 22-page book. Now colouring in comics is, or at least was, considered witchcraft, a true science for the ages. Thankfully, Spawn is a 90s comic, so I don't have to talk about the revolution of colour techniques or full-colour printing, but with the help of colouring firm HELL.O, who were turning things digital, Spawn gained a great deal of style that was still a relatively new art form at the time. And it wasn't just Spawn, because at one time HELL.O were colouring and separating 70% of Image comics themselves, which is crazy when you consider that Image Creative had a reputation for always being late, or at least down to the wire on their deadlines. I can't imagine the stress that these guys must have been under trying to keep these late books from getting any later. So HELL.O were colouring Spawn right from issue 1, but somewhere between 38 and 50 it gets messy and hard to figure out, but here it goes. Todd Broker on mostly even issues between 38 and 50. Brian Haberlein and Dan Kemp doing the odd issues from 41 to 50 and then ongoing as the main colourists thereafter. Quick shout out for additional colourists who worked on Spawn between issues 1 and 100. Roy Young, J.D. Smith, Matt Miller, Jason Gorder, Tyson Wengler, Andy Troy. And so, much like a band, you can see how colourists play an important and sometimes overlooked role in comic book world. Next time you listen to a new song, listen out for each musician. Next time you read a comic book, take a moment to appreciate all the components that made it what it is. So we know a lot about Spawn now, what he looks like and who brought him to life and put comics on the shelves. But what actually happens in Spawn? What does he do? We're only going to talk about the first 32 issues in part 2 of this video, but for now let's talk briefly about something controversial and polarising: the storytelling. Now Todd was, and still is in my opinion, an S-rank artist. He's a rock star with a pencil, the dog-gam Todd father. He brought some serious visual style and edge to the page, but could he write? When the first couple of issues of Spawn dropped, he had quickly created an engaging character with a unique backstory, villains to fight, a world for them to inhabit, and something greater for them all to follow. This was Spawn's inception after all, his first foray into the real world. But was it any good? Was it written well? Well, when you start talking about something being good, you're talking about what you think is good or bad. It's totally subjective, but you can say if the general populace think it's good, or if the industry experts think it's good. I feel like I'm butchering this bit, so I'll let Dave Sim, guest writer for Spawn issue 10, explain. Basically, what happened was the Image boys were taking a lot of flack that first year over the quality of the writing of Image comics. So Todd, whose working theory is always the shortest distance between 2 points, is in your face and backing up over your feet, goes, "Writers? You want writers? Okay, I'll go get some writers. Who's the biggest writer? Alan Moore. Okay, I'll get Alan Moore. Okay, now I've got Alan Moore. Who's the second biggest? Neil Gaiman. Okay, Alan Moore is writing one. Are you in? Second biggest. Are you kidding? Of course he's in. Okay, now I've got a pissing contest going. Who else is supposed to be some great writer? Dave Sims? Okay, get me Dave Sims on the phone. Dave Sims? What? Oh, Sim. Okay, whatever. Listen, it's Todd McFarlane. I've got Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman in a pissing contest down here. Are you in? Are you kidding? Of course he's in. Alan and Neil sell 100,000 copies of their books, and his book sells like 12 copies. I can hear him a chug-a-lugging beer from here getting ready. Who else? Frank Miller? Frank, I've got Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman and Dave Sims having a pissing contest down here. You in? Okay, Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Dave Sims and Frank Miller, all writing Spawn issues. Where'd you go, huh? I could have sworn there was some wimpy little guy here a minute ago whining about bad writing. My eyes playing tricks on me again. So apart from guest writers, Spawn is almost exclusively written by McFarlane up to issue 71, where he was joined in the writing seat by Brian Holguin. This would last up until issue 150. The guest written issues were fun. They could work as individual standalone stories, but also add into the main story of Spawn for future issues to build on. It was a great marketing strategy too. Say that you're a fan of Alan Moore, you hear that he's done a Spawn issue, you might just buy it for his name alone. That might not have been someone who liked Spawn before, but now they've tried it, they might just like it and come back. Quick fire round, spoilers abound. Guess writers between issues 1 and 100, who they are and what they did. Alan Moore, issue 8. Billy Kincaid goes to hell, becomes a Spawn, fat Spawn sad. Neil Gaiman, 9. Fantasy shh. Medieval Spawn, Cogliostro, aka Cog, more on him later, and Angela introduced. Dave Sim, issue 10. Political/industry shish. Very cool issue, stands out as heartfelt and truthful to the situation going on in comics at the time. Frank Miller, issue 11. Typical gang shish. A bit silly, a bit actiony, it's fine. Grant Morrison, issues 16 to 18. Anti-Spawn/Redeemer first introduced and is an absolute monster. Great introduction to a villain. Hero? Oh wait, the baddies. Andrew Grossenberg and Tom Osachowski, issue 19 and 20. Harry Houdini does magic with Spawn. Honestly not a fan of this one. Alan Moore, issue 37. Alan Moore's back, people. The freak is introduced. Julia Simmons, issue 38. Cygor is introduced with tones reminiscent of Frankenstein. Very cool, one of the highlights for me within the first 50 issues. And that was the quickfire round. Now back to the featured presentation. All of these amazing people came together and helped make Spawn a record-breaking success. But what made Spawn so iconic on those comic book shelves back in 1992? The cover art, of course. Covers are key. They catch your eye, they sell your comic. They are the movie poster, but also part of the product. It sets the tone for the book inside. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what happens within the pages. More of just a feeling. Maybe a little like a lucid dream. Sometimes the cover represents the style of art in the book, sometimes it doesn't, and it can be incredibly jarring. I guess that's comic books for you though. You never know what you're going to get till you've got it. I've always found comic book covers interesting and a little frustrating, always wondering when that particular moment was going to show up in the comics. Spoiler, it often didn't. As you'd expect, Spawn takes this to a whole new level with Todd & Co, almost going out their way to outcool each other and themselves, reveling on how badass Spawn looks or some major threat he has to face. It's the epitome of style over substance, but the more I read Spawn, the more I find delight in the gorgeous covers, just as much as the work inside. I still remember how grotesque issue 140 was when I found it in France. I mean, Les Chronicles de Spawn, issue 1, which was a French published collector's edition of a Comic Book Day summary issue, issue 139, and a Salmon Twitch spin-off. It's also the first issue of She-Spawn. No, I can't read French. We've been over this before. Why did I buy it then? Well, the cover, obviously. In the mainline original Spawn series, the first two covers set the tone beautifully, with their interesting colour palettes, and with Spawn front and centre, and yet it's hard to make out the true extent of his appearance, something that draws you in to check out the inside of the book for clues. Cover 7 has a wonderful blue and orange lighting to it, with Spawn standing proudly covered in guns, almost like he stands in the mockery of crime noir, oozing cool. Cover 27 shows Spawn lying against a wall, battered, green necroplasmic blood all over the wall behind him. It makes you desperate to find out what happened and how he inevitably comes back. 30, Spawn is defeated, hanging by his neck. 31, the Redeemer, with green blood all over his helmet. But issue 32, that's the one I decided to use as inspiration for the comic for my Spawn mini. More on that in part 2. Issue 32 is a particularly important issue for me, as it's when Spawn changes and becomes the Spawn I grew up staring at in French, not understanding, but always entranced. All of the covers are a treat for the eyes. It almost feels unfair to only talk about a handful of them here, but I truly could talk about the art forever. Instead, I've saved a link in the description to a website that has great resources for all Spawn covers from issue 1 all the way up to current day. And that's where we'll call it today, folks. If you've never heard of Spawn before, I hope this video was of interest and informative. Stay tuned for part 2 where we will deep dive into the story of the first 32 issues when I paint a Spawn mini. Thank you for your time. I wish you a good day and many more besides. Yours, forever in horror, 2. 2, 6.